Good evening. This is a presentation of the Creation Science Fellowship one-year program. Tonight's topic is the biblical creation model for the life sciences. It's a biblically based program tonight. And my name is Dennis Word. I'll be presenting this talk to you. We have a number of issues to go over and things to go over. We'll concentrate on what the Bible says and how it relates to the biological world around us. If you are attending this class, I recommend highly the basic book I recommend for this particular session is The 6 Days of Genesis by Paul Taylor. It's available through Answers of Genesis and a number of other retailers, Christian bookstore retailers that you can provide. I think it's like $15, but it's an excellent basic reference to the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Okay, let's get into tonight's talk. One with a few comments is that preparatory comments, that we hope that the information we provide tonight will be, of course, useful, but more than that, will provide a foundation for your continued trust in the biblical record of history as recorded in the Bible, and that it is not contrary to a biological model. It may be contrary to a self-organizing evolutionary model, but it's not contrary to a biblical model. In fact, there's evidence which supports this, and we're hoping that the presentation of that evidence will help you in making that decision on your own, that just how good this information is and how reliable the Bible is as a historical book. Okay, we'll move from the title slide to the next slide. In Genesis 1:31, we start out with, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and morning were the sixth day." At the end of the creation, God pronounced that everything was very good. At the end of 6 days of creation, he pronounced that everything he had made was good. And that meant good is in the sense of, like him, perfect, fully functional, developed, and fit for its designed purpose. So within this concept, each of these, or within this process, we're going to give you some principles of biblical biology. The first biblical principle of biology is that all biological organisms were fully developed and functional when they were created. And they all fit their role in their environment. So there's a perfect fit to the environment and to the role they were created to serve within the biological organism's niche or within the whole biological organism system. We'll move on to the next slide. There was an order of creation. Day 3 in this order was earth and vegetation. Day 4, the sun, the moon, and the stars were put around for us for days and seasons. Day 5, everything that lives in the water and flies in the sky was made. Day 6, all the land-based life first, and then in a separate act of creation, a fully formed and functional human to tend and care for and have dominion over all the other created things on earth. Next slide. The order of creation was specifically set up for living things. You needed light and water to provide for the earth and plants. You need the plants to provide for all the animal world. The whole was designed to meet both man's needs and fulfill God's purposes. Next slide. The second biblical principle of biology is that all things were created to be linked together in their physical needs and interactions for the purpose of serving God's plan under a human's management. Humans were to be caretakers of his creation. All things relate to each other in the purpose they play in a great biological chain of interdependence. This can be seen in many ways through our biology. An article published this year, or in 2014, in the Scientist magazine, which is a magazine primarily of all biological research, talked about a maternal microbe and the relationship of bacteria to the mother and to the growing fetus and child. Next slide. That article can be seen here, referenced here as scientists on 5/21/14. And I'll briefly read some of these findings in the summary. The complete article is in your notes. There's much more material in your notes than I'll be talking about tonight or certainly showing on any of these slides. That is all reference material to go back at a future date and help you to remember and as well as review this material if you have questions. At any rate, the findings published today on May 21st in Science Translational Medicine add to a growing body of literature suggesting that tissues once thought to be germ-free are crawling with microbes, and that baby's introduction to the microbial world comes from multiple maternal sources. Another extracted quote says, while many questions remain, it is pretty much taken for granted that the microbial community of the placenta, the vagina, and the breast milk are important for fetal and infant development. Let that sink in a little bit. And finally, the final bit of note on that there are numerous references in the literature to the importance of natural resident skin organisms as being beneficial to our health and nutrition. Another article from the same biology magazine is Scientist on 8/7/14 called The Body's Ecosystem, in which they talk about the eyes and many other parts of the body and the natural symbiotic and commensal relationships between those organisms and the human body and their necessity. So these organisms were originally created not to be disease or injury makers, but were continuing to be part of the interdependent system. Next slide, please. Now we move on to the third principle of biology. Living things certainly are the same in many ways, but there are clear-cut differences among the created kinds from the beginning. Obviously, if you have a designer who's making something, and if you think of genetics and other things as mosaics, tiles, and you have a tile for respiration or needed by air, land breathing, there are certain portions of those genetic relationships that will be exactly the same, because those are the designs that work for the environment and the animal that in question. So among the biological organisms in that question, all the biological organisms. So biological organisms, although they have similarities, are different, okay? But all biological organisms had to live in the same basic environmental condition, but all were created to be immediately functional. That's a very important thing. They were not created in some simplified form and allowed to mutate or evolve into a functional organism. They had to be completely functional in the niche where they were going to be placed, yet they were different as to their needs and to live and survive in the environment they were placed. The created kinds were in harmony with their environment. That's another important distinction to make here as we talk about the creation. This is an entirely different world than what we see today. All organisms started out with an unspoiled and undegraded genetic makeup. My major has always been microbiology, and that's what my graduate work is in, microbiology. And I can tell you that those organisms play an important role in many parts of our lives. Many of the blessings that we have seen come from both the harvesting and use of bacterial organisms in production of both biological agents as well as the production of food products and other items. Next slide, please. The next two slides are to represent what I call the prototypical or the typical generalized description of the two types of cells that we see within the creation of life. And the two types are both the animal cell and the plant cell. Next slide, please. These two slides, although looking similar in many of the parts, are different among the various things. Again, fulfilling the idea. You'll notice that examples are the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Rough endoplasmic reticulum is present both in those generalized animal and plant cells. And those particular organisms use that generalized for the same purpose, and that is to produce proteins. The ribosomes, which make the rough endoplasmic reticulum rough, are where the protein synthesis occurs. And in that particular organism, that's where the proteins are made. Basically, they are assembled. and many of the assembly and modification processes go on in there and immediately outside of there. There are the similarities in the fact of the ribosomes, which are the organisms of translation. Then you look at see the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. This is very important because it buds off the vesicles and acts as a source for transportation and other communication within the cell. The Golgi apparatus is a packaging area and a bundling area, putting together materials and biochemical and biologically active materials to have the cell both actively respire and actively excrete, actively metabolize the food sources to build, repair, or ultimately to reproduce or divide. Next slide, please. In your notes, you'll see a complete list of the organelles for those generalized cells and their functions, both for animal and plant, and at several pages of definitions and notes, but they're good to go back to. If you hear something said about a particular organelle, you can go there for reference within the organ, within the cell rather, and you can also make up your mind about the different relationships and maybe answer questions you hear on the news. Anyway, let's move on. The next slide is design clearly seen in complex interdependent components of the cell. And that's the slide we're talking about right here. What we wanted to say is that, as seen in those previous two slides of the cell, there is a complex set of subcellular components of both animal and plant cells. These components include separate organelles within the cell itself, yet communicating with each other and necessary for the life functions of that cell. These generalized pictures of the cell does not begin to tell the whole story of specialization as seen in complex eukaryotic organisms like trees and humans. Next slide, please. These specialized cells differentiate early on to perform very specific functions for those complex organisms. Even though most contain all the genetic information for the whole organism, what that means is the majority of the cells in the mature form contain all of the genetic information to make the entire organism. But it's not all expressed in every cell because they become specialized, and cells are muted. They are the specific portions of the gene is expressed, specific portions are muted or suppressed. For example, nerve cells, red and white blood cells, bone, intestinal, epithelial cells, smooth muscle, striated muscle, let's say in your muscles, in your heart. So this specialization of cells is also something that's very interesting and not well understood. Well, let's go on and talk a little bit more about this. Next slide, please. Here we see I wanted to read this thing as seen, structural differences in the same base molecules are based on the needs of an organ. For example, collagen comprises a family of fibrous glycoproteins. Proteins comprise of combinations of sugars and proteins that are present in the extracellular matrices of complex animals. Its purpose is to provide high tensile strength, resistance to pulling forces. The collagen fiber that is 1 millimeter in diameter is capable of suspending a weight of 10 kilograms, that's 22 pounds, without breaking. The collagen molecules are arranged in rows but staggered in relation to their neighboring row of collagen, and this provides for ultimate strength. Next slide. However, there's problems in this design. Although it's perfect for producing strength, it makes a problem in some of the areas that's needed for strength, but it's also needed for other purposes. This is where it gets very difficult when you talk about evolutionary pathways or trying to explain by chance or natural selection at all. At any rate, we take the eye of the cornea. The cornea serves as the durable protective layer on the surface of the eyeball, but it must also be transparent in order for the eye to receive clear visual transmission. So collagen of the cornea is different in its arrangement than collagen in other parts of the body. The thick middle layer of the cornea is called the stroma. At this site, the collagen fibers are layered in fibrils like a plywood structure. like you saw in the previous slide. So the fibrils are parallel to each other, and the fibrils in that layer are perpendicular to fibril layers on each side. This structure provides for strength. This delicate tissue, while the uniformity in size and ordered packing, allows for the minimalization of light scattering. What it's saying is the design has to be modified for the particular stroma of the eye to allow for us to perceive. And it is modified. And in its modified structure, it's still strong, but it allows light to pass through for us to be able to see. And the ordered packing minimizes that transparent light being scattered. Now, if you look at the slide we're looking at right now, you can see there's a picture below you out of Wikipedia of the stroma of the cornea, and gives you an idea of the parallel arrangement of the collagen in that particular organ. Next slide, please. Some quotes from the book that I use as a primary reference book for cell molecular biology, which is Cell Molecular Biology by Karp, Experiments and Concepts, Gerald Karp. I have here a quote from that book. Complex unicellular organisms represent one evolutionary pathway. An alternate pathway led to the evolution of multicellular organisms in which different activities are conducted by different types of specialized cell. And that's from that version of the book, Wiley, page 15. Having just talked some of the basic things we saw just in the collagen, and just think of heart cells, the difference between striated muscle in hearts in a heart and striated muscle in the muscles of the arm or other, you begin to see that this is not a very reasonable. It does, in fact, the question I have here is, does that sound like a good explanation of the origin of specialized cells? To me, it doesn't. It sounds like a just so story, a story that we have these alternate pathways, which we don't see happening today, which we aren't observed empirically, but somehow occurred, and the magic master of the whole scenario is time. Okay, next slide, please. Now let's talk a little bit about the order and the biology of the creation model is described in the book of Genesis. Genesis 1:11, and God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herbs yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding the fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth," and it was so. Verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass, and the herb yielding seed after his kind, and a tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. So during this third day, we see the creation of plants. Were they simple single cell organisms, or were they something different? The description given here in the Bible is that the plants were different among themselves in kinds already. And they're different from the fish and the land animals and all the animals and even man. But many, many kinds of plants, different kinds of plants, were created on day 3, different in many different ways, so there was a lot of diversity and a lot of complexity and a lot of duplication of plants. So many copies of XYZ tree or XYZ bush was created on those days, not just one copy. And that's an important perspective to understand when we talk about what may be different between the world being described here and the world we see today around us. 3 points can be made from the above verses. The description of plants appears to be an all-encompassing phrase, referring to all plant life coming into existence on this day. These plants were created with their organ systems in place and working. They were created ready to bear seeds and fruit. Insect-pollinated plants are already fruitful, but they only had to wait a couple days for the bees to be created. This makes sense this makes no sense, rather, if there were millions of years of evolution. It would make no sense for bees. This is the problem with people who, in the church, who feel that the Bible can be made to correlate with a nothing to something scenario of increasing levels of complexity through random mutations and selections. And selection doesn't work on the chemical level. I don't know how that would work. It only works on the biological level. However, there is a word we've been using in the discussion that we need to talk about in point 3 here on this slide. The word kind, introduced, and we're to reproduce ever its kind. The Hebrew word min is being used in a very specific way in Genesis. The kind described here is not the same as the man-made classification system word species. So kind is not the same as a species, what is today in biology classification called species. That's important to understand. One of the other points I want to make, next slide, on plants. Modern creation scientists do not believe in fixity of species as defined in scientific classification. By that I mean the term species used in current scientific jargon is not what's being called the kind. And creation science are not a way saying that the same species exists today that existed at the time of the creation. There has been variation and modification. Creation scientists believe the kinds described here in Genesis are a much broader scope of organisms, more akin to the family classification in the modern scientific classification. Species can change and adapt. Creation scientists prefer to use the word created kind, or bara mean being the word kind, bara created. So created kind, bara mean. Think of these kinds being the archetype of the Barramin of organisms. They are the original prototype, the original design with all the bells and whistles and everything included in their genetic material, uncontaminated, unmutated, unspoiled in any way. Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands is a great example of variations in species. However, the Barramin organism for the finches possessed all the genetic potential for all the organisms that described it. They just was present in the original Barramin for those for those group of finches, and all that simply was selection for those different groups. In fact, within the studies of the Galapagos Islands post Darwin's death and today has shown that the finches have indeed fluctuated between beaked and locations types in frequency based on changes in the environment and weather on those islands, and that simply can only happen if the genetic information is there to begin with. There's no way to postulate genetic information being created from de novo in a species so that it can fit something that happens in an environment. Something happens in the environment and the species either has the information to accommodate or they become extinct. Next slide, please. Let's talk about what is life. It's a hard question to talk about today because so much is classified within science as life and so little really meets the criteria. It's hard to make that, but there are some basic characteristics that a particular biological entity must have in order to be considered alive. The little acronym Mrs. Gren is a good way to remember this. Mrs. Gren is the 7 criteria of living organisms per modern science. And those 7 characteristics we are all familiar with if we took any biology in high school, whatever. Movement, respiration, sensitivity means it responds to stimuli. Growth, maturation is to size, complexity, and development. Reproduction, it's able to make copies of itself. Excretion, that's to remove poisonous or toxic byproducts from itself. And nutrition, that's the ability to be able to obtain the food and to process the food necessary for its growth and survival. Next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit now about the difference between this. Maybe preface it by saying, even among science today, what we know or what we call living has become very, very, very blurred. Certainly, some things that appear to be reproducing and independently reproducing would not meet those criteria. Obligate intracellular parasites like viruses would not be able to do that. Free living, reproducing protein entities like the causative agent of BSE. Are you all familiar with that BSE, which is mad cow disease? Bovine spinal encephalopathy is a disease of animals that was thought to have been spread to human beings, in which a particular malfolded protein was able to reproduce itself. And even by eating the beef, one could contract this malfolded program, even if it passed protein through the liver, through that person's digestive tract and enter the blood, that it would start to reformulate in the brain the protein to fit this this unnaturally formed or constructed protein. Bovine spongiform encephalitis are very, very dangerous, but are they alive? They reproduce, they can be transmitted, they can grow. Viruses are not considered alive, the criteria we spend, but are they alive or are they not alive? Is the Ebola virus a living thing or not a living thing? So even science has to wrestle with these kinds of issues of what we're talking about, and certainly the criteria that were developed of Mrs. Grin is an attempt to correlate that. But we're going to talk about something different. We're going to talk about when God created these animals, He created some of them with a nephesh, N-E-P-H-E-S-H. Nephesh simply means or a living soul, and that living soul is in quotes. What that means that certain animals were considered to have the breath of life. Certain animals were considered to be truly alive, or certain organism. I'm sorry about misuse of the word animal. Certain organisms, certainly certain animals would fall into that category too, but certain organisms may or may not have the breath of life as defined by the Bible, and thus do not meet the biblical criteria of what it considers to be a living thing, a living, breathing thing, something that has a nephesh, or a soul, or personality, if you'd like to think of it that way. Plants certainly do not meet this term, so they cease to exist, but they do not die, per Genesis. That's an important part. The nephesh animals have a soul or a personality. Nephesh animals die, but what are nephesh animals? Let's go to the next slide, please. Nephesh equals living animals, but what is alive? Let's talk to you about Leviticus, the book of Leviticus, which talks about God's description of what animals or what living things are suitable substitutes for sacrifice for the sins committed by man as a living thing. And interestingly, in this passage of Scripture, it says, for the life of the flesh, remember we're talking about flesh, is in the blood. And I've given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. Verse 12, therefore I said unto the children of Israel, no soul of you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger that sojourneth among you eat blood. And whatsoever man there be of the children of Israel, or strangers that sojourn among you, which hunteth and catcheth any beast or fowl that may be eaten, he shall even pour out the blood thereof and cover it with the dust. For it is the life of the flesh, and the blood of it is for the life of the flesh. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, you shall eat the blood of no manner of flesh, for the life of the flesh is the blood. Therefore whosoever eateth of it shall be cut off. Next slide, please. So what we see defined here is that animals with the breath of life are those that had red blood, hemoglobins in their blood. And those were the living beings that God considered to be alive with a personality. Thus, in a general sense, biologically, vertebrates that have blood, as we know, would be classified as nephesh. Some invertebrates also might be of the hemoglobin blood type, may also be fit that classification. This is an area for additional research in creation science in order to understand which organisms, which animals fit that specific category. Some are pretty obvious, some are not. Uh, Next slide, please. Now we're going to go on the aquatic and flying animals. This is found in Genesis 1:20. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth and in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly, after their kind, and every winged fowl after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. And evening and the morning were the fifth day." Again, we see, looking very basically at this verse, we see that many kinds of animals were created. A large number of copies of those kinds were created, and there was a great potential for genetic diversity. There's also some other things that we can gain from this. God's listing of what he created is not a biological classification system. It's an environmental system, a system of where they will live, where they find their niche in the general environment of Earth. And so God first looked at the waters, everything that lived in the water. Certainly, when we look at this verse, we see the whales and the fish are entirely different. And the Bible clearly makes that clear in other verses in Leviticus about which animals are clean or unclean. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But whales certainly are mammals in modern classifications, and they bear their young alive and suckle their young and these things like that. But for God's classification, God's thinking, it was what environment, what role did they fill? And the other thing I want you to see is God blessed them. He blessed them. Okay, let's move on. Next slide, please. Land animals. Let's talk Genesis 1:24. Now God, again, is looking at a different environment, and this is what he's going to create for. He's created the birds in the air. He's created all the animals in the ocean. And God said, let the earth God is talking about here is the dry earth, the non-ocean bottom. Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beasts of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Again, we see the same basic thing that we see in the other verses, that there were many numbers of land animals made of the same kind and different kinds, and many copies thereof. So the earth started out with a very high population of both plants and animals already there, able to sustain one another through the process of eating. And the plants were the primary source of that food. Now, the question we always would bring up at this point is then, all right, so now you got land animals, you got where's man? And so, of course, man was made differently because his purpose was to provide a different role for God. And his role was to be that of caretaker. So let's go to the next slide. And finally, man, Genesis 1:25. And God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. This brings some very important points out about the differences between human beings and animals. Although human beings contain biological processes which are similar because, again, we talked about the idea of mosaics, functional pieces of reproductive material and metabolic material and designs in the genetics that would have to allow man to live on a real earth in a real environment with oxygen and plants and water and everything like that, and be able to function. And those perfectly created pieces were added to the man, and because they were already perfectly pieces of mosaics that allowed it to be done. If you think of the genes in that sense. The other thing I want you to look at this verse is that God, this is the only point where God says he created something in his own image. Let me reflect on that for a second. In his own image. And he says it was both male and female. In God's original economy, men and women were to be equal. In God's original economy, each of them had a role to perform. One in mothering, one in nurturing, one in farming. All together, they were equal. And he blessed them. He blessed them. Nothing was in the world at that time that God couldn't bless. So there was no sin, there was no evil, there was no predation, none of those things that are going on. All right, let's look on to let's go on to another step here and a recap of the creation, a little more detail. The act of creation is different. Well, again, we'll do some summary here. That was the next slide. I said the act of creation is different. There's one man and one woman to start. So there, right away, you can see. Look, biologically, all you're starting is one man, one woman, not multiple copies, not multiples, but a single individual. It was of a special kind, the only kind made in God's image. It had one primordial but perfect genome at the start. Man was the only living pair created in creation to be created as one reproducing pair. This is so that everyone on earth is a relative of everyone else. Everyone on earth is a daughter of Eve or a son of Adam. All of them are sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. All of us are related biologically to that first pair. And there was only one pair. So everything that applies to the human race, and everything that applies to man, applies to all men, regardless of what their skin colors have diversified to, regardless of what their cultures have come about, what their own ideas of corrupted ideas about God. Still, God's idea for man was that they are all to be related as one individual kind. It was a complex and perfect genome, but because it was one kind, one set, it was much less variable as compared to other living organisms. Let's talk a little more deeper about what God did here. God in Genesis, next slide, please. Thank you. Genesis 2:21, the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh thereof. This is the detailed description of his creation. And the rib which God took, taken from man, he made woman, and brought her unto man. And Adam said, this is bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Woman was taken out of man. So there is genetically only one human race. There are not multiple races. There is one human race. This whole idea of a race that we have perverted in the years and the centuries since God's creation has been a perversion to have people discriminate and take judgment on others. But there is all of our brothers and sisters, regardless of their physical appearance, are descended from one mom and one dad. And then next slide. Then in Corinthians 15:39, God reiterates this in the New Testament. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there's one kind of flesh of men, and another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another birds. Animals are of different kind of flesh than man. So animals are of a different kind, created kind than man. Do we see some evidence of that in the biologically cursed world that we live in now because of the sin? Let's talk about it and go to the next slide. This is an older chart comparing the number of DNA's base pairs among different groups of organisms. It's an older, it gives us a picture of it. Today, much has changed in genetics and reproduction, and also certainly within the area of understanding man genetics, in the idea of how cells transcribe themselves, how they reproduce themselves, how they develop, and how they produce the proteins necessary for their life. Base pairs would give you the ones that are similar and give you an overview. But we know today that originally believed that transcription occurred in a linear fashion across a single piece of strand of messenger RNA, producing one gene, one protein, one piece of the genetic material produced one protein. We've since found that was a way too simplistic expression of what goes on. We know now that the proteins can be encoded in both directions. We know that same genes can code for different proteins depending on their cooperation in the area read by the ribosomes. We also know that it's much more complex in its and interdependent in its relationship than previously thought. Many orders of magnitude more information and complexity. Then we throw in the area of epigenetics, the idea that in the chromosomal animals like man, chromosomes themselves, on the chromosomes themselves, outside the genetic epigenetics, means around genetics, is these methylated groups on proteins, histones, and these groups can control the expression of genes, and they do control the expression of many traits, and they are another level of complexity laid in. But be that as it may, if we look at this generalized base pair, we do see that potential for variety or variability can be seen very high among the flowering plants, can be seen very high among many of the groups. But if you look down there to mammals, even reptiles and more, mammals, and that is by modern classification, that is whales, all kinds of people, you will see very little in the way of potential information there. And I think that is an indicator that mammals, and if you slice that out to just man and get rid of all the other mammals, would even be just a tiny slice. Even though that there's a lot of potential for variability between human beings, it is still, compared to what other organisms can vary, it is very small. Now let's move on to the next slide. We're going to move on to the fourth principle of biology. Biological organisms started out perfect, yet based on what we see today, degraded over time. What we see in biology now is not what it was at the beginning. There has been a dramatic change. So we sit back and take a look at this description of what the world was like, and we look at the world around us today, and we say that this is entirely different. This is not what we see. First of all, they were all vegetarians. We didn't see the predation and the disease. What is all of this about? Why? First of all, why, and what is it all about? And the first big change came for the fall. The Bible said everything changed at the time of the fall. The curse came upon man, woman, and all created orders. Some changes noted in the Bible is that initially all animals were to be vegetarian at their initial creation. Next slide. Genesis 1:29. God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed, for to you it shall be for meat. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, when there is life," again we're going back nephesh, "I have given every green herb for meat," and so it was so. So the biblical text here clearly does not include plants in God's order of living things, because He said there was no death before sin. So God set up an order that does not include plants as being living. But going back, because they don't have emotions like animals do, but there was no death before the curse. So even though men were eating plants and animals were eating plants, this was their primary food. This is radically different than what we see today. predation and eating of each other's food, animal. It's just eating one another is just as common a finding you can find out in the real world. Many evolutionists use this as an example of displaying how the God's world was never created perfect. That's because they pick and choose which parts of the scriptures they want to quote. They want to quote Genesis where it says everything was good, and they don't get to the part here in Genesis 1:29, or sorry, in 3, where we see the fall take place. Next slide, please. All that changed now. Death and disease, pain, difficulty in growing plants or food, they all came in because of sin. 1 Corinthians 15:21, for since by man came death, so there you go, came death by man came also the resurrection of the dead. So the promise given to Adam that his seed would crush the head of the serpent was a promise of a redeemer, and that redeemer would be the resurrection of the dead. 15:26, the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. Death was never part of the economy of God's world. Death dominates the whole world biologically today. And Romans 8:22 is certainly a truer observation as can be made. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. Next slide. So let's look at 3:16. Let's look at this fall and what happened. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow. These are what, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Anyway, Genesis 3:16. And we see that I will greatly multiply thy sorrow. This is the curse given to human beings specifically. He said to the woman, I'm going to make your childbirth process very painful and difficult. And you'll in the sorrow of pain and that you'll give birth to children. And your desire shall be your husband, and he shall rule over you. Part of the curse was this hierarchy set up within the human family of the man of being the leader and the woman of being the second. It was set up because of sin. In the eventual end times, that will be removed. All men and women will be exactly equal. They'll no longer be necessary for this. But God had to set up this order because there had to be an order of authority for the family to work. Then here's something else. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. Now Adam is getting this curse. He says, verse 17, because you've listened to the voice of your wife and has eaten the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. And then the verse I was talking about a second ago, thorns and thistles it brings forth, thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In 19 says, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return to the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. Death shall rule. And man was, by the way, this as an aside, is still to be a vegetarian. He is still to be a vegetarian. But the animals and everything else is cursed because of him. And his ability to grow food now becomes toil. Toil. Work doesn't become something that's fun to do. Work doesn't become a nice thing to do. It becomes toil. It becomes sweat of the brow. Hard work to get the basic commodities of life and food for you to live. Okay, and we talked about a woman's no pain in birth. Next slide. Now we got to step back a second and say, now the world we see today is not like the world we saw. So what are the possible changes biologically that took effect because of the fall? These are the ones I think, and in my own mind, are important. Mutations begin and accumulate rapidly. Mutations are errors in the genetic code being produced, and there's a certain rate of mutation in every generation, certainly in human beings and in every organism. The other thing is death principle starts in force for animals. That is unbelievable. Now the animals are dying, the men are dying. Death was never part of the equation originally designed. Violence begins in the world with predation and blood and eating animals. There's changes in structure and function of the animals that could appear and probably did appear. All the what we know today, it's impossible to extrapolate exactly what changes took place, but some may have occurred definitely. And then finally, disease and illness starts eliminating species. The organisms which formerly were participating in maintaining the health of the living species and organisms, man and animals, now turns on them to create death and disease. Next slide. Now we're going to go on to another big change. Again, evolutionists miss this point, but the second big change seen in the biblical record that affects biology is the great biological bottleneck, or Noah's great flood. It wasn't Noah's flood, it was God's flood. But Noah was the patriarch who survived the flood. First, let's talk a little bit about, from a biological standpoint, the survivors. Genesis 7:13, in the selfsame day entered Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them into the ark, 8 people. They and every beast after his kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and every fowl after his kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into Noah unto the ark, 2 by 2, of all flesh, when there is the breath of life. Again, we're talking breath of life again. And they went in male and female of all flesh. Again, God's idea was to repopulate the earth after the flood, as God had commanded him. And here's an important issue. God closed the door. God shut them in. God shut them in. Genesis 7:16. God shut them in. When judgment comes, God makes a decision when it comes and when the due date's up. Next slide. Now, if we go to more detail, we will see that God's plan for the animals in the ark were different depending on the different types of animals. You notice in verse 2 here, it says that of every clean beast thou shalt take thee by 7s, the male and his female, and the beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. So now he's saying there are certain animals that more were taken of than other animals. Of those animals God calls or identifies as clean, the word clean, he wants you to take them in pairs of 7s. So there'd be 14 of one clean animal. 14 lambs, male and females. 7 male, 7 female. Also birds, you notice the fowls of the air, 7s, males and females. Again, 7 birds of each kind. So the birds are by 7s, a clean beast. For clean beasts, if you want to understand what a clean beast is, you have to look in the Levitical law, which defines the clean beast. Leviticus 1:4-47 is a complete quote that covers a section of definition of a clean beast and unclean. And that particular segment is in your printed notes, and you can refer to that. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about the lost ones. The ones that would be lost as a result of this great judgment God was bringing on the earth. Genesis 7:21. And all the flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and cattle, and of beast, of every creeping thing that creeped upon the earth, and every man. So men, animals, all died, all those terrestrial animals. And in whose nostrils was the breath of life, and all that was in the dry land died. We're not talking about the ocean, the fish, or anything like that. We're talking about the dry land. And every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle and creeping things. And the fowl of the air they were taken out too, as well and from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. So what this means is we have a gigantic loss of information. The multiple copies and the multiple numbers are now gone. Also, there was a change in the way things worked after the flood. Apparently, there was a change in the environmental, a change of certainly in the way the cycle of the Earth's weather and climate worked. And in Genesis 9:3, man was now permitted to eat meat. And it says, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb I given you to all things. Next slide. Well, what does this mean biologically? Can we talk about it? Can we talk about it a second? I think what it means is that if you look at population genetics, this is an artistic rendition done by my son-in-law, who's a graphic artist for me, of the bottleneck effect. You look at the first bottle. This is the parent population. You'll notice there are like blue and yellow balls. Well, they represent different organisms carrying different traits within any group. So the bottleneck is whatever the environmental or other type of thing happens that would limit which survivors made it to the next level. In a flood, that would be all those ones who didn't make it on the ark were gone, and all their genetic variants and all their things were gone. And those people, as you see in the next part of the picture where the balls are dropping into the cup, you can see you have, in this particular bottleneck, you're getting more blue ones than yellow ones. So among the surviving individuals, the proportion of individuals with genetic variability has changed. And in the next generation, you can see that the number of yellow balls, indicating those lesser traits, will be much less within the population than the original representative population. And that's what happened in the Great Genetic Bottleneck. Next slide. If you want to look at it another simplistic way, we'll take one gene frequency of one gene, a theoretical gene called A, which is dominant. Capital letters are always for dominant genes, and B, and A, small a, for the recessive. Both are at the same frequency at the beginning before the bottleneck starts, 0.5, 0.5. 0.5, 0.5. They're equal amounts. As they go down through the bottleneck, the size of the bottleneck and what it constricts and where it is and where they are in the environment and where they are when they perish or where they are, if they're on the ark or not, and after the ark, all will affect the frequency at the end. The frequency through a very little or no bottleneck will be the same frequency as before, but you can see the frequency can change. The frequency can change to where your dominant is at 0.67 and maybe your recessive is only at 0.33. Or you can get to a certain bottleneck where only the recessive remains within the genetic pool of that particular gene, and the dominant is gone completely. So it can never be expressed ever again. Okay, next slide, please. The biological effect of the bottleneck and the founder effect. Founder effect means a small number of individual reproducing pairs as they left the ark going to a particular zone of living would affect also genetic variation. We do not know how much mutation, selection, isolation, and environmental effects had on genetic diversity from the fall to the flood. That is unknown. These are unknown factors in genetics. We do not know what was the remaining genetic diversity in the survivors of the flood. We do not know what was lost genetically in the non-survivors. These two gigantic unknown factors present a dramatic and almost insurmountable problem for creation biologists in the classification of biological groups to their creation archetype, to the original kind. This will be discussed in a future presentation on creation genetic. Next slide, please. Brings us to our fifth biblical principle of biology. The biological history of the earth, as seen in the fossil record, is one of abrupt appearance of organisms, mass extinctions, death, and loss of information, rather than the gaining of information by complex organisms. As you can see, what we're saying, this is completely different than an evolutionary viewpoint. What we have is we should see in the earth evidence of mass extinctions, mass loss of information, mass loss, and that should be the predominant role within this particular world we see. Now, if we'll go on, and we're going to start into another section here of some slides. I need to describe those slides to you, and how they and what they represent, and we'll go over them again we as we go forward here. All right, next slide. The biblical principle we just talked about, which is what we should see in the fossil record. And first we're going to have a series of slides, and I'm going to describe them to you before we look at them, and then while we look at them. We're going to look at a series of several slides. First, we're going to look at the standard evolutionary model of geological time as it relates to living things. Then we're going to look at abrupt appearance and rapid death of animals in a scale on another slide. We're going to look at the rapid appearance and extinction of plants and microbiological organisms in that same time scale. Finally, we're going to look at a chart of the time scale which shows the abrupt appearance of life forms and extinction of others, and no gradualism is seen. Fifthly, we're going to see a chart of evolutionary development of the reptile from its presumed ancestors, and in this chart only the darkened sections represent the fossil record. And next, a chart from book Evolution showing the mass extinctions of the fossil record, and finally a chart of the class Mammalia. Okay, let's go back and let's start these particular slides. Next slide, please. First of these slides, geological time standard model. What you notice, I want you to look at here, is from a standard evolutionary text on evolution. The Phrenezoic is the area in which all the complex life exists. You have the Protozoic and the Archean, and some of that is considered to have evidence through biological organisms like singular cellular organisms, bacteria, whatever. Simple organisms, they may have been mixing and occurred there, I don't know. But the real birth of life is in the Cambrian period and the Paleozoic. If you look there, see the Cambrian period. See Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian. Talks about the periods. Some of these you've heard of: Quaternary, Tertiary, Cretaceous, the Jurassic, the dinosaurs, and all those. And but they have eras too: the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic. But Cambrian is noted for its explosion of complex organisms. It's exploding on the scene, just fully formed and ready to go. So now let's look at the next slide. And in that slide, you'll see that animals, in a general sense of animals, between those three, remember the Cenozoic, the Mesozoic, and Paleozoic, and the Cambrian to the Cretaceous, you'll see that organisms waxed and waned. There was no steady increase or decrease necessarily. And in fact, some organisms became extinct, if you noticed the designs there in the Paleozoic. The galactotites, which are small worms, there are related species and related organisms to them today, but is not exactly the same one as seen in the fossil record. So they just disappeared from the face of the earth. One would expect not to be the case with a gradual increase in information, and instead what you see is death, extinction, and abrupt appearance in the Cambrian period. You can see all the names along the bottom, the arthropods, the mollusks, and everything. Next slide, please. Then you see the same approach taken with protists, small single-cell organisms, and plants. And you see the same kind of things. Look, algae appears to be with one break and pretty much stable. Protozoa shows ups and downs, but again, beginning in the Cambrian period. And then there are plants which appear and disappear, which appear fully formed and disappear fully formed. We don't see the transitional forms that one would expect if we were predicting from simple to complex. Next slide, please. This is a slide from a creationist literature, a summary of evolutionary information showing you the various types of organisms and their appearance and disappearance. And you can see that as you go back to the bottom of the chart, the older, you can see some start sooner, some appear, some go away, some die, some become extinct, but they all appear abruptly and fully formed. We don't see this clear-cut differentiation that one would expect within a branching design of evolutionary hierarchy. Next slide, please. This is a book slide from a book on reptiles called the Reign of the Reptiles by a very famous expert in that area, a British, and in it he presents a very honest picture of what is the supposed reptilian history of both the arisal of birds as well as reptiles and their relatives, evolution from the Devonian to the Tertiary period. Again, if you go back, you'll look at the Devonian to the Tertiary period, and you'll notice in this representation that he has colored lines and lighter lines. And where you see the dark colored lines, they represent the actual fossils found in the record. And where you see the light lines and branches are the theoretical, hypothetical branching points for these organisms that supposedly went to be the other organisms. So in reality, what you find are the dark lines, which are all parallel. What you find when you impose the evolutionary concept on it, you have to add all the branching lines. Very, very interesting. Very, very fascinating and very truthful. All right. Next slide, please. Next slide is from a book on evolution, so another book on evolution, and this one deals with the different periods, the Quaternary, Tertiary, the Cretaceous, Jurassic, all of them, from the modern to the old. And within this chart, it may be hard to see, are these break lines. And these break lines represent gigantic mass extinctions of organisms. Mass extinctions of organisms. If you look in the Paleozoic to the Mesozoic, you'll see it says as the most severe mass extinction in Earth history occurred between those two periods of geologic time. I mean loss of information. Tons and tons of loss. And then if you look between the Mesozoic to the Cenozoic, you'll see another major mass extinction, including the disappearance of all the dinosaurs. Again, a mass extinction of a very large proportion. So what I'm trying to say is what you see in the fossil record is evidence of rapid appearance, fully formed, and destruction and death and loss of information. Most of the species on Earth are extinct. Some have become extinct within historical record. Most became extinct in the geological record. And some are still becoming extinct today as we change the environment in which these animals live, never to be recovered. The passenger pigeon, I forget what year it died in the 20th century, it was the last one alive. That's it. We've lost the DNA for the passenger pigeon. It's gone. So the dodo the same way. So I think you have to understand what we're losing, we're not gaining. Okay, next slide, please. And I'd like to look here at an interesting thing. This is a chart. I know it's hard to read, but it is the chart dealing with the complexity of the orders and families of the class Mammalia. These are all of the current organisms that are put in by classes and orders of different animals or groups of animals that would fit into this class of Mammalia, mammals. It's unbelievable, the diversity. The diversity from monotremes, like platypuses, up to shrews, to big cats. All of it's there. All of it's there. The marsupials, all of them, the carnivores, are all in there. And that much diversification is within that one class of animals, Mammalia. That much informational diversity is within that. It's fascinating and hard to assume that this is a product of gradual accretion. I think neo-Darwinism is dead. It's been dead for a while now, but the alternative by Gould and others was too frightening for the neo-Darwinists to embrace, and punctuationalism. But it really, that's what it looks like. It looks like rapid exposure. And this cannot be. So they've gone back to a 150-year-old theory of neo-Darwinism, And because they can't take the punctuationalist theory, which requires miraculous events of major mega mutations occurring, almost like magically within the record, to allow these processes to go forward. Next slide. And finally, the final principle, and we'll go over this briefly. The sixth principle in biology: what we see now in the world around us will be different than what we see in a later time. Things will be dramatically returned to their first state. Next slide. In Revelation it says, I knew heaven and new earth. The first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. As John said, I, John, saw the holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming down from heaven as a bride adorned. And a great voice saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. And verse 4, God shall wipe away all their tears from their eyes. There will be no more death. Think about that. There will be no more sorrow, no more crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things are passed away. And the one that sits upon the throne said this is going to happen. Next slide. Revelation 22, 1-2. And it says, He showed me a river of pure life crystal coming out of the throne of God and the Lamb. In the midst of the street of it, this is in Jerusalem, on either side of the river was the tree of life, and bore 12 different fruits, and yielded every fruit every month, the 12 months of the year. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Isaiah 65 says, I create a new heavens and new earth, the prophet Isaiah, and the former shall not even be remembered. Be glad and rejoice. And I will rejoice, and verse 19, and I will rejoice in Jerusalem, and joy in my people, and the voice of weeping shall be heard no more. No more weeping in Jerusalem. No voice of crying. Next slide. And then Isaiah 65:25, the wolf and the lamb will feed together. Everybody's going to be back to eating plants. The lion shall eat straw like the bullock. And thus shall be the serpent's meat. They shall not hurt nor destroy in my holy mountain, saith the Lord. There'll be no more predation. There'll be no more of this killing among the animals. And finally, Revelation 22:21, I complete this talk with, He which testified the things, saying, Surely I come quickly. Amen. Even so, come quickly, Lord Jesus. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen. Next slide. Thank you for listening to the presentation. The picture you see here is just a fascinating one. It's a picture of people watching the atomic tests in the 50s, or sitting on a deck of a ship in their bare legs and fans, and all with their glasses in their eyes, where they're watching hydrogen and atomic explosions take off on the island, and they're all being exposed to radiation. And you say to yourself, who would be as foolish to do that? Because those scientists, and they're all scientists and special observers, all didn't know anything about the long-term effects of radiation, low-dose radiation, or any dose radiation, and many effects on human growth and development. These are the smartest people in science of the day, and all they are watching the explosion, yet they didn't know all the things that were going on. So the scientists of our day look back on the earth around them and all the things and the evidence of creation and destruction, and because they won't accept the biblical record, they're as mystified as these people are, and as uncertain of the coming judgment of God, and they are uncertain of what has happened. And just because science today says it, these people were very smart scientists. They didn't see it, and yet the same today. Thank you for your time, and any questions can be sent to me. Thank you very much.